Good morning, everyone. My name is Bhumika, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this MHS Talent Insight series session titled Assessment Fusion, Integrating Tools for Optimal Solution Design, presented by MHS R&D team members Joanna Solomon, Iris Lynn, Kelly McDonald, and Janine Victor. We're thrilled to have you all here with us today. For those of you joining for the first time, welcome. We would like to begin by telling you a bit about MHS. For over 40 years, MHS has provided trusted data-driven solutions across our core disciplines. Our MHS Talent Solutions help to drive success in professional settings. We understand the elements of effective leadership and the requirements for an effective workplace. With our capabilities and toolsets, we help clients identify and cultivate talent. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our presenters. Kelly McDonald is a research scientist at Multi-Health Systems. She holds a PhD in social psychology and is experienced in developing assessments and developmental products tailored to the talent industry. Kelly has a deep interest in understanding the impact of emotional intelligence and resilience within organizational settings. Joanna Solomon is the manager of psychometrics at Multi-Health Systems. She holds a master's in industrial organizational psychology and has been developing assessments for 10 plus years. She is a member of the ITC Guidelines Committee and is the associate editor of The Score, a publication for APA's Quantitative and Qualitative Methods Division. Janine Victor is a psychometrician at Multi-Health Systems. She holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and possesses experience as an IO professional in psychological research, academia, and medical legal reporting. Janine has a deep interest in psychological measurement as well as employee remuneration and reward. Iris Lynn is a research scientist at Multi-Health Systems. She holds a PhD in industrial organizational psychology and specializes in developing assessments and products for the talent industry. Iris has deep interest in cross-cultural dynamics in the workplace and using research-based insights to enhance performance and culture. Now, I would hand over to the ladies to start the webinar.
Thank you everyone for coming today. We're excited to talk to you about how assessments can be used across the employee lifecycle. In particular, we're going to be looking at their use across the stages of selection, onboarding, development, and succession. And we're going to talk about how assessments can support each stage and complement one another together for greater insights at each stage. So we're going to be using some case studies to showcase the utility of assessments at each of these stages. These case studies were inspired by real client problems and scenarios, but of course have been anonymized for the purposes of today. So I am going to kick off the assessment fusion discussion by talking about that first step of the employee life cycle, which is selection. Simply put, selection is the process used to evaluate job candidates and then determine who to hire. Why do organizations care about selection? Well, over 75% of organizations face challenges in recruiting full-time employees, and nearly half struggle with retaining those employees. So as a result, organizations are really looking for thoughtful ways to identify the best candidates for a job through their selection processes. We have likely all been through selection processes before. Some processes are far better than others, but well-developed selection systems can really benefit organizations immensely by hiring qualified candidates who are going to perform better on the job, which then in turn minimizes that turnover and results in more revenue for the organization. So we're going to look at a case study today in which assessments were used as part of the selection process and then take a look at what value those assessments brought to it. So the case study is, I'm going to read it out loud for everyone here. The director of sales at a mid-sized financial services company is facing challenges when trying to hire a manager of sales to lead a team of 10 to 12 junior sales associates. The organization is struggling with meeting their revenue targets, and there is a need to hire a manager who displays many of the competencies that are required to be a good salesperson. So building relationships, confidence, assertiveness. The hired manager also needs to be an effective leader. The last manager who was in this position was a competent salesperson, but really struggled with teaching the junior sales associates effectively, speaking up when needing to, and managing the stress that came along with the position. So the manager really needs to be someone who can come in and coach those junior employees and encourage innovative ways of selling their services while also managing the stress that comes along with that position. So whenever we're using assessments in selection, the first step is always to determine which competencies we need to assess for the role that we're hiring for. So in this case, the job analysis has been done and we know which competencies were needed in order to be successful in this role. And we also know that we're going to be using standardized assessments as one of the methods to assess those competencies. So the competencies that we've identified for this role are interpersonal skills, stress management, sales knowledge, confidence, assertiveness, innovation, and coaching. And I really want to bucket these competencies under two main headers. So we have our sales-related competencies. So recall that the organization needs this person to be a good salesperson. And then also leadership-related competencies. So again, recalling that the organization really needs this person to step up and manage this group of junior associates, coach them, teach them to be innovative, all while managing their own stress. So for those sales-related competencies, we decided to use the Sales Aptitude Profile Assessment, or the Sales AP, which measures 8 competencies that are related to being an effective sales professional. So you can see what those 8 competencies are up there on the screen: selling-related knowledge, self-confidence, persuasion, sociability, composure, competitiveness, assertiveness, and achievement motivation. In our situation, when we look at the competencies that we set out to measure for this case, the Sales AP can be used to measure the interpersonal skills competency, the sales knowledge competency, confidence, and assertiveness. And then for the remainder of these competencies, we're going to use the Emotional Quotient-Inventory 2.0, or the EQI 2.0, which is a measure of emotional intelligence. The EQI is really nice for these situations because there are so many components to it that can be mapped onto different competencies, and it has decades of use in the talent market and has been well established as a scientifically validated assessment of emotional intelligence. So from this assessment, you get a total EI score. You get what we call composite scores, so 5 of those. So that's your self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal, decision-making, and stress management. And then under each of these composite scores, there are 3 subscales, so 3 further areas of distinction. So for example, under the self-perception composite, you'll get a self-regard, self-actualization, and emotional self-awareness score. So tons of data that can be pulled out from this model. Getting back to our scenario, we're going to use the EQI to look at the rest of the competencies apart from that sales knowledge one. That one's not measured by the EQI. So for some of these competencies like interpersonal skills, we will have insight from the Sales AP and the EQI 2.0. And then for some of the other competencies, we'll just rely on the EQI as the measure. So for these bottom 2 competencies, innovation and coaching, the EQI has an interesting way of getting at these that I just want to tell you a little bit about. So the EQI leadership report looks at 4 common leadership competencies such as innovation and coaching, and it looks at which subscales from the model are related to these competencies. So it gives you this overall snapshot of how well the person did on that competency. So for example, in the coaching competency here, you can see how a person, not our candidate in this situation, did on the subscales related to that coaching competency. And we can do the same thing for innovation. So for our candidate, we will look at these patterns of results to see how well they do. All right, so we know our competencies. We know how we're going to measure these competencies. I'm going to show you the results of one candidate who took these 2 assessments, and then we'll see what insights we can glean. So looking at the results from the Sales AP, the scores are in percentiles for each subscale, which is represented in the red circle at the end of each bar graph. For simplicity, we're just going to get a sense of the candidate scores by looking whether they fall in the low, mid, or high range. Starting with the candidate strengths, we see that interpersonal skills and sales knowledge are real strengths for this candidate, so that looks great. But assertiveness and confidence are in the low range here, so definitely something to keep our eye on. And remember that these 2 competencies are also going to be assessed by the EQI, so we'll be able to see how the candidate scored on these competencies on the EQI as well. But overall, from a Sales AP perspective, the candidate has some key skills like interpersonal skills and sales knowledge, but is also raising some flags for some of the other scores. But we'll see how that all comes together after we see the results of the EQI. So here are the EQI results. You can see the candidate score just to the left of the graphs, and scores that are less than 90 are considered in the low range. Scores from 90 to 110 are mid-range, and then above 110 is the high range. And what we find is that assertiveness is high here, which is counter to what was shown on the sales AP. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And in terms of strengths, we see the interpersonal composite and the stress management composite showing up in the mid to high range. And similar to what we saw for sales AP, we see self-regard, which is a way of measuring confidence, is fairly low for this candidate. And recalling that we're also interested in the competencies of coaching and innovation. So the report will link the subscales that are relevant to those competencies. And for this candidate, we see that coaching and innovation, all of the relevant subscales are in the mid to high range, with the subscales for coaching appearing to be a little bit higher than the subscales for innovation. But overall, this candidate is looking pretty good on these competencies. So when we put the results together for these two assessments, across the two assessments, some insights we have is that the candidate has some strengths in interpersonal skills, sales knowledge, coaching, and innovation. So lots of really good things. We also know that we need to do a follow-up on assertiveness. So one assessment is showing a low score, one is showing a high score. The initial hypothesis around this is that each of these assessments have different operationalizations of assertiveness, and the sales EP looks at it in a narrower setting, such as a sales setting, compared to the EQI, which looks at it in a broader sense and also touches on assertiveness with emotion, so communicating emotions more openly. If I was on the hiring committee, I would definitely want to follow up on these results and dig a little bit more to understand them. And then finally, when it comes to areas of development, it's clear this candidate has lower self-confidence that was exhibited across both measures. So how are we going to use this information? There are a few different ways we could. First is with cutoff scores. So if the organization has evidence that cutoff scores are appropriate, fair, and legally defensible, of course, for the manager of sales role, we could use these scores to remove or retain this candidate in the selection process. We could also use these results to inform interview questions. So we know that confidence seems to be an area of development for this candidate. So we could ask for examples of times that the candidate displayed confidence and validate or potentially invalidate their low scores that we saw on the assessment. And we could also use interview questions to further explore those interesting results around assertiveness and dig a little bit more into that. Finally, we could use these results for future development initiatives. So if this person does end up getting hired for that manager of sales roles, we could use the results from the assessments to inform future development plans. So again, we know they have that low confidence scores. Could we address that as soon as they come in? Could these scores form the basis of a 360 as they get hired and onboarded into the organization? So hopefully this gives a brief glimpse into how assessments could be used in the selection process to inform next steps for candidates. And I'm going to pass it to Joanna now, who is going to tell us about assessment use in the next stage of the employee life cycle, which is onboarding.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm going to talk about onboarding as the next stage in the employee life cycle. And onboarding is really about bringing a new hire into the organization and introducing them to the content and context of their role. Entering a new organization, especially somebody new to the industry, new to the field, this is a really important step. And from the employer's perspective, this has lasting impacts on how long they stick around with the organization, how they fare in the workplace, and how their performance goes. Assessments can be a really useful tool at this stage to help quickly get to know somebody, figure out some onboarding strategies. And we'll talk about this in more detail, but onboarding strategies vary and can be formal, informal, and involve a whole array of teams. Like Kelly, I want to talk you through a case study first, again, inspired by real events, and let's see how assessments can be used. In this scenario, a small technology company is growing, and the software engineering manager posted a job opening for the software engineer. After going through the selection process, a promising young candidate was hired. The candidate impressed the hiring committee with his technical ability gained through classroom experience and school projects, paired with recent success in a summer internship. At the internship, this candidate created software that improves customer account management in a large retail organization. His references praised his ability to learn quickly by seeking information from those with more experience, and although he's a bit junior in the field, they were optimistic he'll grow professionally as he tackles new challenges. He has limited experience working in teams, but excelled at independent tasks. So really, the main activity during this onboarding step in an employee's life cycle is to get to know each other. The employee needs to get to know their new role, their new team, their new manager, the whole organization. The manager needs to also get familiar with the new hire and find the best way for the new hire to contribute to the team, and so that the manager can provide the best support. To do this, I want to walk through 3 steps. First, both parties need to gather as much information as possible. So it's important for the manager as well as the individual themselves to gain awareness of their personal preferences and work styles. Using that information, the manager can evaluate what's standing out as an opportunity to drive success or to develop further, and how it might mesh with their own style and that of the team. And then step 3, they'll actually plan and execute those onboarding activities. So to do that, to gather information, I want to highlight 2 tools in particular. Number 1 is the Pearman Personality Integrator. And the Pearman Personality Integrator is a personality type assessment that examines an individual's natural and demonstrated types, building off the long legacy of Jungian research. It provides information into the mental functions in terms of introversion, extroversion, sensing, intuiting, and thinking, feeling. And it's also unique in that it explores that natural versus demonstrated state, since behaviors really can vary by setting. It's a great level of insight into how somebody might behave at work and where they might feel strain if they operate outside of what's natural to them. It can be a very helpful tool to provide common language to discuss individual differences and why certain people or tasks might provide more of a challenge than others. The Pearman Personality Integrator has 2 parts, and the second part is the Flex Index. These are developable skills that might help them leverage the mental functions when performing tasks that are outside their comfort zone, and generally fostering resilience in ways in which they can bolster their unique preferences. The other product I want to talk about here is the CSI and the CSI2, which is an upcoming revision to the CSI, which is the Change Style Indicator. It's not a measure of skills, but it's actually a measure of just preference or attitude. It provides insight into how someone prefers to approach change and what style they might take. This is really helpful to know because the attitudes towards change certainly would come up during an onboarding experience. This is a big life change for many people, and it can arm the leader with the best clear path about what would suit this particular individual. It could also be used in the context of the whole team, especially as mentioned in the case study. The company is growing, the whole team is adding new people. The whole team will experience a change, just like this individual who's joining the team and the manager themselves. So the CSI2 could really help prepare the leader to navigate that change effectively and give common language to the team to collaborate and transition together. So the new hire, as we mentioned, was asked to complete the Pearman Personality Integrator and the CSI2, and let's look at all those results together. First up is the Pearman, and we'll look at part 1 of the Pearman, the personality type. And here you can see he scored more introverted than extroverted, the I at the top, more sensing than intuiting, that S in the middle, and more thinking than feeling, that T at the bottom. So this tells me that he prefers quiet reflection, one-on-one, smaller meetings. He likes dealing with data, details, and facts, things that are concrete and tangible, and prefers to make decisions with logic and rules as opposed to feelings and values. The second part here is the Pearman part 2, the Flex Index. And here it's those subskills that are related to resilience and agility. And here I can tell that he's very skilled at proactivity with a score of 114, but he could develop his connectivity with a score of 81. Over on the Change Style Indicator, I can see his score puts him at a 12, which is a slight conserver. You can see the little V mark on the graph. This tells me that he prefers gradual incremental change, appreciates details, routines, and structure, and respects existing processes and hierarchy. Putting these 2 scores together, these 2 results from the Pearman and the CSI, gives me the insight that he may make logical decisions, but without always considering the emotional impacts or group harmony. And this comes from having a low connectivity score and a high score on thinking. He may require and actually go seek out information, especially when tackling something new. And this comes from a really high score in proactivity with a preference for being a conserver on the CSI. He may also appreciate lots of detailed directions and next steps. This might be a really good strategy for how he proceeds to do work by having a high score on sensing and preferring to be a little bit of a conserver here. This is a bias towards present-focused and concrete actions. And given that he's junior in the role, he will likely need help to think through next steps and figure out what his next actions should be. So here are some of the steps taken in those first 60 days to ensure a seamless onboarding experience. With the support of team members and HR, the manager planned frequent one-on-ones, reflecting his introvert preference and having smaller meetings rather than large groups. She also set up time so that he could process information and reflect on materials before meetings. She also provided him with an onboarding buddy to field questions and welcome him to the team, as well as provide some informal training. Because he prefers a conservative approach to gradual change rather than anything too radical or sudden, he might feel more comfortable on a listening tour first, shadowing other team members before being asked to contribute on his own or to a major activity. She also provided him with a lot of materials to get familiar at his own speed, like organization charts, project overviews. She also took time to clearly set out expectations for his performance evaluation, since she knows that he values concrete and detailed information and would want to be able to plan ahead, given his preference for sensing and his conservator approach. This was also a good opportunity to use the CSI too with the whole team to understand the whole group's approach to change so that the manager can help transition that new hire as well as possible and anticipate future transitions, especially within a growing organization. What if, instead of this case study, it was modified a little bit, and instead of those results we saw, we had something that looked like this on that Pearman personality part 1 section. Here, there's a misalignment between the natural and demonstrated types. You can see naturally it's more of the intuiting type with the N, and the demonstrated type is a very strong S, sensing. In this case, the manager and the new hire might want to reflect on whether these job demands would cause strain because he might be working against his natural type. And if so, are there additional skills that we need to develop, think about, or foster? Things like resilience and recovery. Or maybe there's some kind of job crafting that they can do to find ways to really play to his strengths as much as possible. If his change style also switches, and now he's a strong originator, this might be a really good sign that he's either open to learning new tasks and thinking about new job demands that might be outside of his natural style, or maybe it's another great sign that job crafting would help modify the role to suit this person as best as possible. At the most extreme, it might even be a cautionary sign about job fit. So if somebody with this profile is receptive to radical change and is pretty novelty seeking, so seeing that discrepancy between what's natural and what the role actually demands could lead to strain and may lead to somebody opting out of a job, self-selecting into something maybe more suited for their style. In my own experience, I have seen this happen, and it's always a really helpful moment of realization. So although the role matched their experience, their background, their education, it didn't quite match their personality and preference. And so taking the Pearman and the CSI in this way shed light on the important distinction between those two things. In the instance I experienced, it led to somebody moving out of a role in a research setting, which was really detail-oriented, very deliberate and slow-paced and quite independent, into a sales role so that they could leverage their research and skills, but in a more interactive, interpersonal, fast-paced, dynamic setting. However, this tends to show up after onboarding, once someone is more familiar with the role and has had the opportunity to perform various tasks. So I'll turn it over to Janine now to speak more about the development stage of the employee lifecycle.
So I will be discussing the pivotal role of assessment fusion in employee development. And we know that in today's business environment, a systematic approach to improving the skills, knowledge, and capabilities of our employees is not just beneficial, but it's essential. And by investing in employee development, we not only enhance individual growth, but also significantly contribute to the overall success of our organization. And psychometric assessments help us understand our employees better. By leveraging them, we can create a more capable workforce. After all, investment in our people is an investment in the future. So here's the development case. With a diverse client base and a rapidly evolving digital landscape, a multinational tech company has experienced significant growth over the past 2 years. The marketing department, comprised mid-level managers responsible for executing strategies and overseeing teams, plays a critical role in maintaining the company's competitive edge. However, these managers appear overly frustrated due to several challenges, such as ongoing technological changes, rapidly changing consumer preferences, and managing diverse and expanding teams. And this highlights the need to implement a structured employee development plan. So in the initial phases of tackling these challenges, this particular company prioritized the key skills and abilities essential for both the employee's role and the organization's objectives. And 2 critical areas for development were identified. The first one being emotional intelligence, and the second one being resilience along with adaptability. And for emotional intelligence, the organization focused on competencies such as self-actualization, interpersonal relationships, reality testing, and stress tolerance. In terms of resilience and adaptability, challenge, control, and commitment were emphasized. Highlighting these competencies were important to ensure that mid-level managers were well prepared to thrive in their roles. So the first 4 competencies were measured by the EQI, as Kelly described earlier. And as she mentioned, the EQI measures emotional intelligence, and it's quite a comprehensive assessment. It helps individuals understand their emotional strengths and areas for development, which can lead to improved personal and professional effectiveness. And the first competency identified was self-actualization. And this was to look more closely into how likely managers were to pursue goals that were meaningful to them. The second competency was interpersonal relationships, and this was to determine whether managers could understand and relate to their team members, which would have been essential to addressing any frustrations. The third competency was reality testing, and this was used to assess the ability of these leaders to remain objective and see things as they really are, without being clouded by emotions or bias. And then the last competency for emotional intelligence was stress tolerance. And this was to look more closely at the manager's ability to cope with and handle the ongoing changes without becoming overwhelmed. So once the mid-level managers completed their assessments, they had an opportunity to pinpoint both the strengths and areas needing improvement. So let's look at the detailed results for one of the mid-level managers, highlighting his specific competencies and providing a clear picture of his capabilities, as well as potential growth areas. So this manager's self-actualization score fell within the low range, which potentially indicates that he may have felt as though he was navigating without a clear purpose. In this sense, he might have felt disconnected from true potential or purpose. The rest of his scores fell within the mid to high range. So for interpersonal relationships, this manager may have focused on people and building strong relationships in his role. In terms of reality testing, he likely demonstrated the ability to remain objective and offer clear, realistic guidance to his team. And then for stress tolerance, he likely possessed a range of effective coping strategies to manage and mitigate the impact of challenges and difficulties. And this brings us to our second set of competencies. And this was for resilience and adaptability. So the assessment used in the specific development context was the Hardiness Resilience Gauge, or the HRG, which essentially measures how effectively a person can cope with stress. It provides a total hardiness score and evaluates 3 key qualities which are crucial for predicting resilience, and that is challenge, control, and commitment. So for challenge, this was to assess the extent to which managers were able to see changes and disruptions as opportunities for growth. For control, this was used to determine whether managers believed they could influence outcomes, which aids in feelings of empowerment. And then finally, for commitment, they wanted to determine how deeply engaged and aligned these managers were in their work, especially in the face of challenges. So presented on this slide are the HRG scores of the same manager we focused on for the EQI. And the first point to note is the comparison between the stress tolerance subscale from the EQI and the overall HRG scores. And this alignment suggests that this manager was likely capable of handling stressful situations in quite a healthy and effective manner. So with regards to the individual subscales in the HRG, high range score on challenge suggested that this manager was likely to enthusiastically embrace change and interpret new situations as exciting. For control, his mid-range score suggests that he likely had the skills and resources to influence aspects of his life that were within his control. And then finally, for commitment, this manager's mid-range score indicates that he likely had a sense of purpose in his life, although there could have been some opportunity for improvement here. But yet he felt that most of the activities he did were quite exciting and stimulating. So now that we have scrutinized the 2 assessments individually, we can look at what fusion could look like. And with low self-actualization and mid-range commitment, this manager might have exhibited reduced dedication and engagement in pursuing goals that aligned particularly with his true self. And the combination is quite interesting, but could mean that while he was mostly committed to his goals or responsibilities, he might have felt slightly disconnected from his true self or unsure about his path. The second point is mid to high interpersonal relationships, relationship scores, and mid-range control. So strong interpersonal relationships, as we know, are the bedrock of effective leadership. And by building supportive networks, this manager might have mostly had a good sense of control, knowing that he had a reliable support system to lean on. The third point, mid-range reality testing and control, speaks to objective leadership and how such leaders are better able to focus their resources and efforts on areas where they feel they can actually make a meaningful impact. And by concentrating on what he could control in most instances, this manager likely made more effective decisions and solved problems efficiently. And then finally, for mid to high stress tolerance and high range challenge, this manager likely tolerated stress well and embraced challenges with a positive mindset, adding, of course, to resilience and adaptability. Okay, so after completing the EQI and HRG assessments, a leadership coach then assisted managers in identifying areas for further development. So the process began with setting specific goals. In this case, the manager wanted to enhance his self-actualization by setting meaningful goals, focusing on activities or goals that aligned with his values and passions to boost self-actualization, while leveraging his commitment to mostly stay motivated and resilient would certainly have been beneficial here. And then in terms of progress monitoring, he had bi-weekly leadership coaching sessions to address his goals and work on an improvement plan. The EQ360 was also administered, and the EQ360 offers comprehensive feedback from peers, subordinates, and supervisors. And in this particular case, it was used to identify gaps between the manager's self-perception and how others perceived him at a particular time. And then finally, to measure effectiveness, the effectiveness of a program, periodically retaking assessments was encouraged to gauge progress, and comparing scores was suggested to evaluate the impact of development initiatives and make the necessary adjustments. So in summary, fusing certain psychometric assessments during employee development can be invaluable, as it could firstly provide improved development plans, then targeted coaching to focus on specific competencies, comprehensive self-insight for employees to gain a deeper understanding of their own abilities, behavior, and potential, boosted leadership skills for managers to lead more effectively, and finally, long-term success. And that's it from me. So now let's move on to the next stage of the life cycle with Iris, who will be presenting on succession planning.
Okay, thank you, Janine. So the last stage of the employee life cycle that we'll be covering today is succession planning. Succession planning is the process of identifying and developing people to fill key positions when a vacancy arises later. Succession planning basically creates a talent pipeline that ensures the smooth transition of leadership and business continuity. However, because this process involves a lot of effort and planning and a deep awareness and understanding of the talent that an organization needs now and into the future, many organizations don't do succession planning well, if they do it at all. So for example, the Harvard Business Review reported that only 54% of boards are grooming a specific successor, and 39% have no viable internal candidates at all. So succession planning is a multi-step process, and you'll see on the slide some of the key steps and questions that should be considered. Step 1 is to identify which positions in the organization are critical and vulnerable. Some questions you'll want to consider are which positions, if left vacant, will cause major difficulties in achieving current and future business goals, which positions will be difficult to fill because they require particular expertise and/or because the incumbents possess a wealth of corporate knowledge. Step 2 involves identifying the competencies for the critical and vulnerable position. So ask yourself, what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, and competencies that are needed in this position for them to achieve success? Step 3 focuses on identifying the organizational roles that you want to make up your talent pipeline. So think about which positions best align with the successor role in terms of duties and experiences. What are the gaps between the two roles? Does the position cultivate the core competencies needed to perform in the successor role? Next, you identify those employees who are interested and assess them in step 4. So reflect on whether you've spoken to each of your employees to discuss their career plans and interests. Do you have enough candidates who are ready to advance or whose skills and competencies could be developed in the time frame needed? Once you identify those employees who are interested and qualified, the next step is to create the appropriate development and knowledge transfer plans to upskill those potential successors. Key questions for this step include, do employees have learning plans that are linked to the appropriate KSAOs required for the current and future position? Do you encourage your employees to work in teams and to cross-train each other? Have you asked whether the employees who are planning to retire within the next few years if they're interested in participating in a mentoring arrangement? And lastly, it is important to also evaluate the effectiveness of your succession planning. So questions that can help you identify your evaluation indicators are, do you have a pool of employees who are qualified to compete for key roles and positions? Are key positions filled quickly? And do your new employees in these key positions perform effectively? So in the scenario that we'll be covering today, the general manager, the GM of a luxury hotel, has announced their intention to retire in the next 2 years. In a hotel, the GM oversees multiple departments to ensure smooth operation and guest satisfaction. This GM has been in this role for over a decade and possesses an enormous amount of organizational knowledge that could negatively impact a hotel if this information is lost. Consequently, the board has determined that a succession plan needs to be put into place to identify potential candidates for the role while the GM is still with the hotel. Based on their own experience, the GM notes that the candidates should possess expertise in luxury hotel hospitality management, strategic planning and problem-solving capabilities, strong leadership and team management skills, and demonstrate the exceptional communication and interpersonal skills needed to manage escalated guest relationships. While there are few employees who have the potential to want to excel in this GM role, these individuals also have areas they need to work on before they'll be considered fully qualified. So the step 1 of this process has already identified that this GM role is considered to be a critical and vulnerable position. In step 2, this involves identifying some of the competencies needed for this role, which includes the technical knowledge and experience in the luxury hotel industry, and also some of the competencies that are critical for leadership that are bolded on the slide, such as strategic planning, influence, stress management, and problem solving, as well as some competencies needed for maintaining good guest relations, such as communication and interpersonal skills. Then we go to step 3, which is creating your talent pipeline. So here we identify roles, and upon reviewing the competencies and duties and the day-to-day experiences of all the other leadership positions in the hotel, it was determined that the front office manager and the housekeeping manager roles were the most aligned with that of the GM. Then step 4, we started identifying those employees who were actually interested in one day assuming the GM role and assessing their current competencies. So upon conversing with the front desk and the housekeeping managers, it was discovered that the housekeeping manager was happy in their current role, but the front desk manager had expressed a desire to undertake new challenges. Because of this, the front desk manager was asked to complete the influence style indicator assessment. This assessment was chosen because a key behavior of effective leaders is the capacity to influence those around them. So to influence effectively, leaders must be skilled at getting their opinions and ideas heard, recognized, and considered by others. The influence style indicator measures a person's preference for using 5 different styles of influencing when interacting with other people. Additionally, because a large part of the GM role involves managing teams and handling complex interactions with hotel guests, interpersonal and communication skills are also very important. Consequently, the front desk manager's results for the Mesquite 2 were also gathered. The Mesquite 2, which is a soon-to-be-launched revision of the original Mesquite, measures people's emotional intelligence skills, specifically focusing on their ability to perceive emotions, connect to the sensations of emotional experiences, and understand emotional vocabulary and the causes of emotions, and lastly, to manage emotions to achieve specific outcomes. So looking at the results independently, the front desk manager's results for the influence style indicator showed that they had moderate preferences for using asserting and rationalizing approaches when influencing others. People who use these approaches tend to push their perspectives, ideas, and beliefs onto other people. They also tend to use techniques such as logical reasoning, rational persuasion, and the use of relevant facts and data to support their arguments. Looking at the Mesquite 2, results for this front desk manager, it showed that they achieved an average score for their overall emotional intelligence, but closer examination of the scores revealed that they were exceptionally skilled at perceiving emotions and managing emotions, but they experienced more challenges with connecting emotions and understanding emotions. So when we look at these two assessment results together, when you combine the moderate rationalizing preference with a considered developing connecting emotion score, it suggests that this leader may prefer using facts and logic to gain other people's agreement, and they may not understand or connect to the emotional experience of other people. This may result in the emotions of others not being taken into consideration, causing employees or hotel guests to feel ignored or unimportant. When you look at the moderate asserting preference with the expert perceiving emotion score, asserting is best used when there are critical decisions that need to be made in a timely manner and employee compliance is an acceptable outcome. So in these situations, having a high score in perceiving emotions allows the leader to be able to effectively interpret how people feel about the decision that is being pushed on them. By accurately perceiving emotional cues in people's faces, their body language, and other contextual cues. The front desk manager had a slight preference for the bridging and inspiring influencing styles, but they had an expert score in managing emotions. A high score in managing emotions suggests that the leader is extremely skilled at selecting the strategies needed to achieve desired emotional outcomes. This suggests that the leader is fully capable of inspiring others and building collaborative relationships to achieve common goals. But combined with the influence style results, this suggests that even though the leader is fully capable, they are not fully leveraging the bridging and inspiring influencing styles. Lastly, when you look at the underutilized negotiating style, combined with the considered developing understanding emotion score, this suggests that the leaders may not fully understand the context and the underlying causes of emotional conflicts, which makes them less prepared to engage in effective negotiations with other people. So now that we understand the assessment results, step 5 of the succession planning process states that a development and knowledge transfer plan should be made to help upskill this employee. So this occurred by setting specific measurable goals, such as working with this candidate over a period of 1 month to develop their understanding of the 5 influencing styles, and having them practice using their underutilized styles over a period of 3 months. Their development progress was also monitored and regularly reviewed. For example, this candidate had weekly meetings with the current GM to discuss the effectiveness of using specific influencing styles when achieving specific outcomes. And finally, after a period of development, the candidate retook the assessments again to assess their readiness to assume the GM role. So even though I mentioned that succession planning is a 6-step process, I'll be ending our discussion bit here today because today's session is primarily focused on the use of assessments. And I also want to make sure that we have enough time to address any questions that you may have. So next, I'll pass it back over to Bhumika.
So I have the first question. If using assessments during onboarding, would you recommend retesting at any point?
Absolutely, you can. You can retest, especially if you've done an intervention, you expect to see progress, you want to see how things change over time. But to be honest, you need to let the time pass. So I think at the point at which you would be retesting, it might tip into that next stage, that development stage that Janine was speaking about, and maybe it's no longer onboarding at that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. The next question is, when would you use a 360 versus just self-report tools?
Usually when I'm deciding what types of assessments to use at the different stages of an employee life cycle, I like to think about a couple things. So, for example, what is the time and resource investment that will be involved? The value or usefulness of the information that you can potentially collect, as well as thinking about things such as the privacy and confidentiality of the test taker themselves. So if you were to think about, say, a selection process, because a 360 usually involves collecting data from raters such as the person's leaders, their peers, their direct reports, using it during selection might not be ideal, because many times the people that you're asking to be your raters might not even know that the individual is applying for a different position. Similarly, if you think about onboarding, a 360 might not be as helpful because usually the new coworkers, the new managers have not worked with the individual long enough to be able to provide meaningful feedback. That's why you'll most likely see 360 being used during the development phase. Occasionally, it may be used to inform the succession of an internal candidate.
Right. Thank you so much, Iris. Great information in that answer. I would move on to the next question. How many is too many assessments to use at various stages?
So in all the examples we provided, we only spoke about 2 assessments, but it doesn't mean that more can't actually be used. There are logical and practical considerations as well. So like the time taken to complete their assessments, maybe it's got to do with budgets or financial costs. But I think there are other potential drawbacks to also consider. And this would be like candidate fatigue or maybe overwhelming them. So reducing the candidate experience, which is obviously very important. And there are also things like redundancy issues. So you need to ask yourself, are using more assessments actually leading to better insights? And obviously too many assessments may complicate the process without adding much additional value. And the point here is that we basically need to find a balance between gathering enough data and insights, but also consider the time and the energy of candidates. And I think it's just important that we think about the types of assessments and how well they align with what you are looking to actually assess. Focused evaluations might include 2 to 3 assessments. If you're maybe measuring a range of qualities, then perhaps 3 to 5. But in my opinion, anything more than this might be challenging given things like complexity or redundancy, and then fatigue in the process, as I mentioned. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Janine, for the answer. I'll move on to our last question for this session. How do I make sure I pick the right assessment for each stage?
I'm going to say that there are 3 things that you're going to really want to focus in when you're making sure you're picking the right assessment, regardless of which stage of the employee life cycle you're talking about. The first thing is going to be making sure that you're picking an assessment that measures something meaningful and related to what you actually want to measure. So really taking that time up front to figure out what exactly it is that you're trying to measure. So in selection context, that would often come via job analysis, but at any stage in the employee life cycle, step 1 is going to be making sure we define what we want to measure with the assessment. The next thing is something near and dear to my heart, and probably most people, most of us presenters, given that we're on the R&D team, is making sure that you are picking assessments that are reliable, valid, and fair. So from a reliability perspective, making sure that the assessment is consistently measuring what it's purporting to measure. From a validity perspective, making sure it's measuring what it was designed to measure. And then from a fairness perspective, making sure that the assessment truly measures the same concepts in the same way for all individuals, regardless of demographic characteristics. So a good assessment will have all of that information documented about the reliability, validity, and fairness. So we definitely want to make sure that that is weighing into your decision as well on which assessment you're going to use. And then the final thing that I would consider when trying to make sure you're picking the right assessment is just to make sure the output from that assessment aligns with the decisions that you're trying to make. So for example, if we have someone in a leadership development program and we get their scores handed to us, but no interpretation information about what those scores mean, that might not be overly helpful. Or in a selection context, if the scores I'm receiving as output are not normed on a reasonable comparison group, I might want to look into that a little bit more and think more about it. All of that to say, very long-winded way of saying, I would say make sure the assessment measures what you need it to measure. It does so in a reliable, valid, and fair way, and the output of that assessment matches what you want to do with the results.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Great answer. With that, we are at the end of our session. Thank you so much, Kelly, Joanna, Janine, and Iris. It was an insightful and an engaging session today.